We'll reconvene the committee, and if we have our next panel come forward. Thank you in advance for your testimony. Thank you for your participation in today's hearing. I think it's a critically important hearing. And thank you for your patience in putting up with the congressional floor schedule, we'll say, at the moment. It's a little bit unpredictable, but there's two stories. Either we're going to have about an hour, or we're going to be right back on the floor very quickly. So we'll see. Our next panel is made up of Mr. William E. Wright. William Wright was appointed to the U.S. Chemical Safety and Hazards Investigation Board in September 2006. Immediately prior to his appointment to the board, Mr. Wright served 5 years as chairman of the Department of Defense Explosive Safety Board. Mr. Wright served in the Navy Special Operations Explosive Ordnance Disposal Community, and Mr. Wright earned his bachelor's degree and a master's of business administration from the University of Puget Sound, and from the master's of arts degree in the National Security and Strategic Studies from the U.S. Naval War College. Tammy Miser lost her brother, Sean Boone, in 2003 in an explosion at the Hayes Lemaire's cast aluminum automotive wheel manufacturing plant in Huntington, Indiana. Ms. Miser is the founder of the United Support and Memorial for Workplace Fatalities, an organization that provides support memorials and awareness to families of workers killed on the job. She was a winner of the 2007 Tony Mazzocchi Award from the occupational section of the American Public Health Association. Edward Folk was appointed Assistant Secretary of Labor for the Occupational Occupational Safety and Health in September 2005. Prior to his nomination, Mr. Folk was a partner in the law firm of Jackson Lewis of Greenville, South Carolina, and Washington, D.C. Mr. David Sabardi is an attorney with Keller and Heckman in Washington, D.C., and represents clients in the areas of occupational health, safety, toxic substance management, pesticide regulation, employment law, and product safety. He's a certified industrial hygienist. Amy Spencer is the senior chemical engineer at the National Fire Protection Association in Quincy, Massachusetts. She has been with the NFPA 12 years, and prior to joining this organization, she worked at the National Institute of Occupational Health and Safety. Welcome to the committee. We look forward to your testimony. When you begin, a green light will go on, and when you have 1 minute left of the 5 minutes, an orange light will go on. We'd like you to try to wrap up your testimony, but we certainly want you to complete your thoughts and the purpose of your testimony, and then there will be a red light. And again, Mr. Wright, we're going to begin with you.
Thank you, Chairman Miller, Ranking Member McKeon, and distinguished members of the committee. I am William Wright, testifying today on behalf of the U.S. Chemical Safety Board, including members William Wark and Gary Vischer. I commend you for convening today's hearing and for your leadership on this issue. Mr. Chairman, the disastrous accident at Imperial Sugar is but the latest of a long series of tragic dust explosions going back over decades. Dust explosions kill and injure American workers, destroy jobs and businesses, and shatter communities. No one knows that better than Tammy Miser. After losing her brother Sean to a dust explosion, she has courageously dedicated her life to drawing attention to this deadly hazard. Mr. Chairman, these human tragedies are preventable. Without accumulated dust, the most catastrophic type of dust explosion will not occur. Good engineering and safety practices to prevent dust explosions have existed for decades in the standards of the National Fire Protection Association, NFPA. In 2003, the CSB investigated 3 catastrophic dust explosions in North Carolina, Kentucky, and Indiana that caused a total of 14 deaths and dozens of injuries. We found that all 3 facilities had long-standing dust hazards. State OSHA officers had inspected all 3 facilities prior to the accidents, but the dust hazards were never recognized or cited. Furthermore, the CSB determined that all 3 explosions could likely have been prevented if the facilities had implemented NFPA-recommended practices. Like these others, our preliminary findings indicate the explosion at Imperial Sugar appears to have been a multi-stage event. An unknown primary event most likely dislodged sugar dust that had accumulated over a long period on surfaces throughout the facility. This dislodged dust fueled devastating secondary explosions that killed and burned workers. This facility was decades old and had many horizontal surfaces where dust could collect, such as overhead floor joists, rafters, and ductwork. Witnesses have described substantial snow-like accumulations of sugar dust on these surfaces. Most employees and contractors have received little training on the explosion hazard from accumulated dust, and no witnesses have indicated that the facility had a program to fully implement NFPA standards for combustible dust. Our investigation to date clearly links the accident at Imperial to many earlier dust explosions investigated by the CSB and others. In November 2006, the CSB completed a comprehensive study of the problem of combustible dust. We determined this problem was nationwide and urgent. The problem shows no sign of diminishing, and in fact, the Imperial accident last month is the deadliest industrial dust explosion in the United States since 1980. Our dust study identified 281 dust fires and explosions that occurred at U.S. businesses between 1980 and 2005, causing 119 deaths and 718 injuries. And since 2005, about 70 additional dust explosions have been reported. The CSB study called on OSHA to develop a comprehensive regulatory standard for dust explosions in general industry, to improve training of OSHA inspectors, and to require better communication of dust hazards for workers using material safety data sheets. And as an interim measure, we also recommended that OSHA establish a national emphasis program to better enforce existing standards. And we commend OSHA for having undertaken such a program in October 2007. OSHA's existing requirements, including the General Duty Clause and the Housekeeping Standard, apply to combustible dust hazards. However, a comprehensive dust standard would be more effective by focusing both employers' and inspectors' attention on this hazard and the steps that should be taken to prevent dust explosions and fires. In 1987, OSHA issued a standard to prevent grain dust explosions. This standard has cut deaths and injuries from grain dust explosions by 60%. The grain dust standard requires a formal written housekeeping program with cleaning schedules, identification of priority cleaning areas, and the immediate safe removal of any dust accumulations over 1/8 of an inch. In addition to housekeeping industrial facilities need to consider proper equipment design, maintenance, building design, explosion venting, and control of ignition sources. Finally, workers must be made aware of the hazards of combustible dust and trained on the safe methods for working within dust environments. The NFPA codes contain recommendations on all these topics, and like all other voluntary consensus standards, the NFPA dust codes will need to be carefully reviewed and adapted to create regulations that are reasonable and appropriate for a wide variety of affected industries and workplaces. Mr. Chairman, we urge the prompt development of a comprehensive dust standard as we recommended in our 2006 dust study. This will not only save lives, protect U.S. jobs and businesses, but also protect our communities. Thank you for the opportunity to testify today, sir.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I'd like to thank you for the opportunity to appear here today to discuss the proposed legislation, H.R. 5522, the Combustible Dust Explosion and Fire Protection Act of 2008. I would like to begin my testimony by expressing my deepest personal condolences to the victims and to the families of those who were killed or injured in the explosion at Imperial Sugar refinery in Port Wentworth, Georgia. One death in the workplace is one too many. Every employee in OSHA takes the agency's mission very seriously, and they also join me in expressing their condolences to those affected by this tragedy. When the explosion occurred at Imperial Sugar on February 7th, OSHA responded immediately. A team of highly trained experts from OSHA, along with an outside expert on combustible dust, were on the scene to help ensure the safety and health of first responders and prevent additional injuries or deaths from occurring. For example, OSHA compliance personnel conducted air sampling and declared an administrative building off limits when OSHA inspectors found potential flammable vapors caused by sugar fermentation. While early indications suggest that the Imperial Sugar refinery explosion occurred due to an excessive accumulation of combustible sugar dust, Our investigation will determine the cause of the explosion and whether any OSHA standards were violated. If this is the case, I assure you that OSHA will act swiftly to issue citations and impose appropriate penalties. Combustible dust is a recognized workplace hazard, and OSHA uses a multi-pronged strategy to address this hazard. OSHA already has tough and effective standards and policies on the books that addresses combustible dust hazards, including the standards covering general requirements for housekeeping, electrical safety, ventilation, hazardous location, hazard communication, and emergency action plans. A list of all 17 OSHA standards that relates to combustible dust is attached to my written statement as Attachment A. If workplaces are in compliance with these standards, accidents from combustible dust can be prevented. OSHA uses enforcement to ensure these standards are being followed. Last year, OSHA implemented a comprehensive national emphasis program for combustible dust. This proactive measure was based on a regional special emphasis program on combustible dust implemented in 2004. The National Emphasis Program focuses on workplaces where combustible dust hazards are likely to be found and discusses activities that can create combustible dust. Along these lines, and in an effort to provide an even greater emphasis on high hazard facilities, OSHA recently expanded the Combustible Dust National Emphasis Program to focus on facilities with a high probability of catastrophic event. Overall, OSHA will conduct approximately 300 combustible dust inspections this year through the National Emphasis Program. In addition to combustible dust standards and enforcement, OSHA has undertaken aggressive outreach to the regulated community. We are working to promote their understanding of potential catastrophic impact of combustible dust and inform them of the means to reduce this hazard. For example, in 2005, OSHA issued a Safety and Health Information Bulletin, or SHIB, entitled Combustible Dust in Industry, Preventing and Mitigating the Effects of Fire and Explosion. This SHIB was made widely available and was recently mailed to 30,000 workplaces that are prone to combustible dust hazards. We also sent out an alert letter to state administrators of the occupational safety and health programs run by the 23 states. OSHA has hosted educational outreach sessions on combustible dust, and OSHA has also disseminated information and education compliance assistance materials related to combustible dust, included interactive web-based training tools on various occupational safety and health topics. Further, we recently posted a combustible dust webpage and a combustible dust fact sheet to make it easier to find these guidance materials and other combustible dust resources. OSHA is developing new guidance materials, including a hazard communication alert. We recognize the need for specialized training in combustible dust. We have provided advanced training for over 350 of our compliance safety officers. This week, we conducted a 2-hour refresher course on combustible dust for 700 of our enforcement personnel. We will also offer combustible dust as a topic in the Susan Harbord Training Grant Program. OSHA has taken strong measures on combustible dust. Nevertheless, the agency is carefully considering all options to deal with combustible dust, including rulemaking. OSHA continually evaluates its combustible dust efforts, and the information gathered through its new National Emphasis Program will be critical to this effort. The existence of a standard does not ensure that hazards will be eliminated. Many tragic accidents could have been avoided or minimized if the employers had complied with existing OSHA standards. We do not yet know whether noncompliance was a factor in the tragedy at Imperial Sugar, and it would be unfair to publicly assert that today. But ultimately, employers are responsible for the safety and health of their employees, and OSHA stands ready to work with all interested parties who are committed to workplace safety. Thank you, Mr. Chairman, for inviting me here today, and I'll be happy to answer any questions you may have.
Thank you for inviting me here today to testify, and I would like to start on the night of October 28, 2003. This is the night of the aluminum dust explosion at Hayes Limmers International, Huntington, Indiana. My brother Sean Boone and 2 co-workers went in to relight a chip melt furnace, and they decided to stick around a few minutes just to make sure that everything was okay. And Sean's back was towards the furnace when they were picking up their tools, and there was a blast. Some say Sean got up and started walking towards the door, and then there was a second, more intense blast. Sean didn't die instantly. He laid on the building floor while the aluminum dust burnt through his flesh and muscle tissue. The breaths that he took burnt his internal organs, and the blast took his eyesight. Sean was still conscious and asking for help. Hayes never bothered to call the family and let us know that Sean was injured or that there was any kind of explosion at all. We received a call from a friend of my husband, Mark's, and he told us that Sean was on his way to Fort Wayne. When Mark reached the hospital where they had all been transferred, she asked if Sean was there. Well, they had an unidentified white male there, so nobody had even bothered to identify who my brother was. The only way he was identified by his apparent body weight and structure, because he had no body hair and no physical markings to identify. We drove 5 hours that night, hoping and praying it wasn't my brother. Sorry. This still brings about guilt because I wouldn't wish this on anybody. We arrived, and the on-site pastor told us to prepare ourselves because he hadn't seen anything like that since the war. And the doctors told us that they weren't going to bandage him. They refused treatment because they said that even if they took his limbs, his internal organs were burned beyond repair. And that was pretty apparent by the black sludge they were pumping out of his body. I went in to see my brother, and maybe somebody that didn't know him wouldn't recognize him, but he still had some remnants of his eyebrows, his red eyebrows on, and he also had the same face. It was splitting and a little swollen, but he was still my bub. Our family immediately started talking about taking him off of life support, and if we agreed to do this, we had ultimately given up on my brother. It would mean that we were taking his last breath. And even though we weren't to blame, we were still making that decision. And we did. We watched the machine stop, and we watched my brother die before our eyes. We watched him take his last breath. And the two things that I can always remember and that never leave are his last words, "I'm in a world of hurt," and his last breaths. I truly feel for these families at the Imperial Sugar plant. All of them that have had horrible, horrible injuries and deaths, because I know where they are, and I know where they've been, and I know where they're going. I'm really disgusted and I'm hurt. It's the same hurt I felt when my brother was killed, because this information was out there, and it could have saved him. And it could have saved these people at the Imperial Sugar plant. Everybody knows what caused this explosion, and it would have been nice to prevent it. We know it's feasible, and it's beyond negligent to expect companies to do this on a voluntary basis. I really strongly believe in OSHA, and I believe it's necessary, but only if it's working. And I felt that in this case, it's failed, and it's really failed miserably. Not only have they failed these families, but the previous ones. I followed the chemical board study, and I came up for that hearing. And I was really excited because I really thought with them giving recommendations, something would be done. I thought finally something would be done. But the only thing that did result in that was a bulletin on the combustible dust. And at the very beginning, the first things that it says in this safety and health information bulletin is not a standard or regulation. It creates no legal obligations. And I don't see how this can be expected to be taken seriously when they're sitting there telling them right off the bat that there's really no legal obligation for this. I remain hurt and angry at the lack of compassion by the corporations and OSHA, because no matter how much time goes by, the pain never goes away. It never fades, and the incident never dies. Our losses are a lifelong, needless sentence because a few people couldn't or wouldn't do what was right. And in conclusion, I would ask you to please support this bill for combustible dust. Thank you. Sorry.
Thank you for your testimony. I appreciate how, I think all of us can, how difficult it is for you. Mr. Savardi.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. These kinds of hearings are always difficult for all the participants, and I want to express my personal condolences to Ms. Miser and to the people in Port Wentworth who suffered this tragedy. I have been around situations like this before. It affects not just the families, but the friends, neighbors, and communities. And I want to support what Mr. Barrow said this morning. This tragedy in Port Wentworth, as the tragedy Ms. Miser suffered, is going to affect a lot of people for a long time. I want to thank the committee for inviting me to participate and for holding this hearing. I'm here to represent the Chamber of Commerce and to provide some insight from our perspective on the proposed legislation. I want to say at the outset that I've submitted a written statement to the record, and I hope that'll be introduced, and I'll just make a few remarks here as we talk about this problem. I've been doing industrial hygiene and occupational safety and health for nearly 35 years. One of my earliest positions was in a company where we actually had to deal with combustible dust, flammable liquids, an enormous array of occupational hazards in the workplace. And I can tell you that that experience leaves me humble every time I see an incident like this. And the reason I'm humble about it is because I'm not always sure I understand exactly what happened. One of the things that I did in preparing for the testimony was I went back and looked at the CSB's report on the case in North Carolina, the West Pharmaceutical case. And what struck me about that particular report was the fact that a lot of the things that we're talking about in the NFPA standard were actually done. The engineers had paid attention to some of these issues. They had thought about them. They'd had planning meetings about the kinds of things that they were going to be doing, what kinds of hazards they could encounter. I'm not suggesting that they were infallible. It's obviously that they weren't. But what makes me humble about these things is the fact that not only the engineers, but everybody who appeared at that West Pharmaceutical plant missed the question of what was going on above the ceiling in that facility. And I will tell you straightforwardly, I expect I would have missed it as well. And I've looked at these kinds of problems for many, many years. Without getting into any great detail, I can certainly talk about this at length, but I can tell you that given the way that the plant was designed, given the materials that were involved, I don't think it was knowable in advance that this dust would accumulate above the ceiling because of the nature of the chemicals that were involved in the nature of the processes. And that's one of the difficulties that we have. People are fallible. They make mistakes. The one common theme that I've heard so far from the previous three speakers and also from Mr. Barrow and Mr. Kingston this morning is that we know how, in many cases, to prevent these accidents. What the problem seems to be is that the people who are actually involved, the employers and employees involved in these facilities, don't have the information. And the one real serious deficiency that I see in regard to solving the problem in the future is that we haven't done an adequate job and haven't even begun talking about how do we get that information into the hands of the people that need it and make it effective. I want you to understand, business is not opposed to having standards. Standards give us guidance, standards give us certainty. We understand then what our obligations are when the standards are clear and unambiguous. The problem with the NFPA standards is that they are often more ambiguous in certain aspects than we would like them to be. They make it difficult not only for employers to comply, but for the agencies to enforce them. So it's really important to spend the time in transferring a standard from a voluntary compliance program like NFPA to a mandatory standard that would be enforced through the force of law. Not because we want to water down the standard or change it, but to make sure that it gives clear instructions and clear understanding to everybody involved. So we know that the information is present and it is available. The question is, are we going to use it? And I can tell you that the Chamber and the people that I work with, the employees that I work with, are committed to making these standards work and to work with OSHA to come up with standards that are effective. And we'll do so, hopefully, in a process that OSHA adopts once the process of investigation in Savannah is completed. Thank you, Mr. Chairman, for your time and attention.
Thank you. Ms. Spencer?
Thank you. Good morning, Chairman Miller and committee members.
Ms. Spencer, we need your microphone on there. Thank you.
I appreciate the opportunity to speak to you about the Combustible Dust Explosion and Fire Prevention Act of 2008. My voice isn't very strong this morning. I'm on the tail end of a cold, but I hope my message will be strong. I'm Amy Beasley Spencer, a senior chemical engineer representing the National Fire Protection Association, NFPA, and have worked at the association for 12 years. I serve as the staff liaison to several NFPA technical committees responsible for documents dealing specifically with hazard recognition and control of dust hazard processes. NFPA supports the Combustible Dust Explosion and Fire Prevention Act of 2008 and believes OSHA should develop a mandatory standard to address and mitigate dust hazards by incorporating by reference the relevant NFPA codes and standards. Today I will provide a brief background of NFPA, a description of the relevant codes and standards that address dust hazard processes, and conclude with discussion on how I believe these documents could provide a safe and effective strategy for identifying and controlling processes that store, handle, or use combustible dust or other combustible particulate solids. NFPA is an international membership organization that develops voluntary consensus codes and standards that are adopted by state and local jurisdictions throughout the U.S. and the rest of the world. The NFPA consensus process and the periodic revisions of all documents ensure state-of-the-art practices and safeguards are included. NFPA has more than 250 committees made up of about 4,000 experts who represent diverse interests such as enforcers, users, consumers, manufacturers, designers, researchers, insurance, and labor. These experts in their various fields serve as members of the technical committee to write nearly 300 codes and standards. In fact, one of the NFPA dust committees has technical committee members from both OSHA and the Chemical Safety Board, CSB. Many NFPA codes and standards appear as mandatory references cited throughout federal agency regulations, including DHS, DOT, CMS, EPA, and OSHA. NFPA codes and standards provide a broad-based and comprehensive set of requirements applicable to many hazards, including combustible dust. NFPA's principal dust document, NFPA 654, Standard for the Prevention of Fires and Explosions from the Manufacturing, Processing, and Handling of Combustible Particulate Solids, covers the fundamentals of dust, protecting the dust hazard processes, and its handling and conveying requirements are often referenced in other dust documents. We also have commodity-specific dust documents covering coal, sulfur, combustible metals, wood dust facilities, and agricultural dusts. In fact, the operations at sugar refineries such as Imperial Sugar are within the scope of NFPA 61, or agricultural dust standard. I don't want to bore you with the long names and numerical designations, but NFPA provides comprehensive coverage of dust hazard in 7 dust-related documents originating as early as 1923. The fundamental requirements and best practices found within these documents have been highlighted in the Combustible Dust Explosion and Fire Prevention Act of 2008, as well as the CSB recommendations and industrial peer-reviewed journals. The necessary requirements to prevent fires and explosions include minimizing production and release of dust to the workplace and housekeeping procedures to minimize dust accumulation, thereby minimizing the fuel source. Written programs are required to manage the hazard. Equipment maintenance is required to minimize ignition sources. All our dust documents address the hazards of combustible dust in 3 simple steps. First, hazard identification, in terms of the type of dust and its means for generation in terms of ignition sources. Secondly, hazard evaluation, a risk-based assessment of the various processes and equipment used in dust hazard processes. And third, hazard control measures, including building construction and location, explosion control and deflagration venting, housekeeping, fire protection systems, and management of change. In conclusion, if we are to safely and successfully regulate industrial processes that involve dust, the challenge for us all is to effectively disseminate the information to provide sufficient training and ensure consistent enforcement. NFPA codes and standards adequately address how to mitigate or eliminate hazards of combustible dust. We encourage any action on your part that will more aggressively require compliance with these codes and standards. Moreover, we believe the best method to accomplish this safety goal is for OSHA to develop a mandatory standard to address and mitigate dust hazards by incorporating by reference the relevant NFPA codes and standards. NFPA is committed to assist where appropriate in these activities, and for all these reasons, we support the Combustible Dust Explosion and Fire Prevention Act of 2008. Thank you for your attention and the opportunity to testify.
Thank you again. Mr. Wright, you state in the beginning of your testimony that that these tragedies are in fact preventable, and that's the basis on which you, I assume, looked at this problem. That prevention could be the result of both the investigation and your recommendations.
Mr. Chairman, that's correct. We believe these are preventable events. I'm encouraged that OSHA has sent out 30,000 letters advising and apprising people in various industries of the potential hazards and to raise their awareness. But this is basic knowledge. It doesn't set the bar with respect to a standard. And that's why we still hold with our recommendation that a formal standard should be adopted that everybody will abide by. That'll also increase the awareness of inspectors as well as employers with respect to the dust hazard.
And you consider that, or the board considers that critical to the prevention?
Well, yes, sir. That's why we made the recommendation in our dust study.
Thank you. Mr. Folk, you don't seem to agree with that recommendation at this point. Is that correct?
No, Mr. Chairman, I'd say that this is something we are looking at all the recommendations. We do take very seriously the recommendations of the Chemical Safety Board. Matter of fact, if you look at our overall record with respect to all the recommendations of the Chemical Safety Board has made to us over the years, we have implemented over 73% of those recommendations in some form or another.
So some form or another that worries me here, but go ahead.
Well, and I'd be happy to discuss the individual ones, but what I would say is that we feel, first of all, we took their recommendations and we started to work on a number of those recommendations. One of the recommendations was, as part of the combustible dust study, was dealing with doing some type of special emphasis program. We instituted our national emphasis program. We actually had a local emphasis program in place for combustible dust earlier on. We then also had one of their recommendations was to do training. We have done training of over, as I indicated in my testimony, over 1,000 of our personnel have been trained on the combustible dust. And also the question about on the standard. We are, as we get our information from our national emphasis programs, as we go out and research or do the inspection to determine what is the items that we find, the violations that we find for combustible dust. We're going to look at that. We believe that we have, as indicated, 17 different standards that are applicable to combustible dust. We're going to look at our results from our national emphasis program, and if we determine that we don't cover everything that we need to cover, then we will consider rulemaking as a strong option.
Mr. Wright, when you looked at the totality of those regulations, the housekeeping standards, the general duty standards, your conclusion of the Chemical Safety Board was what?
Well, Mr. Chairman, I believe that those are good applicable rules for cleanliness and keeping the workplace clean. But oftentimes in these cases, the dust is hidden, as was pointed out in the West case. And I do take a little exception to the witness that said that sealing dust was sort of an unknown at that time. I believe the NFPA at that time specifically sealing should be tight from dust. And that's why our report read the way it did. I still think, and my colleagues agree, that we should have a formal standard so that employers and inspectors can keep this on people's minds for the long run and not just for a short period of time with an emphasis program.
Well, I think we're drawing a difference that concerns me. Chemical Safety Board has done, I think, what we would all consider a rather exhaustive and comprehensive study of this problem, and they recommend that we go to a standard for this purpose, not knit together a series of standards from other codes and other reasons. And that's their recommendation. And in your testimony, Mr. Falk, you stand that all on its head. Instead of first a recommendation that we have a comprehensive standard, you say first they recommended OSHA have a national emphasis program. We initiated a national emphasis program in 2004. Second, the Safety Board recommended offer training throughout OSHA Training Institute. We recognize the combustible dust hazard prevention. We have been offering these training for several years. How many people have taken advantage of that?
The training for our personnel?
Yeah.
We have trained, we have a 3.5-day conference.
No. The general training program before you started the 3.5-day program.
The general training, well, all of our co-shows, when they do their initial training, receive combustible dust training.
So you're telling me that the people who are now taking the 3.5-day training have all had the initial training?
Yes, Mr. Chairman. Before any co-show can go on out on conduct inspections, he or she goes to a series of a number of years of training on different safety and health standards and all our procedures.
Okay. We'll ask you to verify that. But then a page later, you get down to lastly. The Chemical Safety Board recommended OSHA issue a combustible dust standard. And then you tell us how if all your standards are followed, the workplace will be safe. The explosions suggest that that's not the case.
Well, Mr. Chairman, I would say that the testimony of most everybody here has indicated that combustible dust explosions can be prevented. And the reason it can be prevented is because if you eliminate the dust, there cannot be a combustible dust explosion. And our position, and that's part of why we're doing the National Emphasis Program, is to outreach to and inspect these facilities where there are potential combustible
Mr. Savari's testimony was people in the facility had the information, they just didn't act on it.
I'm not sure.
They didn't have the information about the sealing because it wasn't called to their attention. But it would have been had you had these other standards in place from the Fire Association. Well,
Mr. Chairman, I would say this, that we have been enforcing and citing employers for combustible dust hazards under a housekeeping standard, a number of these standards since the early 70s. So we have been issuing citations on this, and the courts have the Review Commission and the courts have both determined that combustible dust is encompassed in part of the housekeeping, as part of the housekeeping standard. So if the employers comply with the housekeeping standards, there would be an elimination of the dust, and thus there could not, it would eliminate or at least mitigate the hazard of having a combustible dust explosion.
I don't read the Safety Board's recommendations and finding that they agree with that, but Mr. Wright, is that accurate, that the housekeeping, if they were in compliance with housekeeping, that would?
Well, sir, I would just refer back to the OSHA standard for grain dust. I mean, when that standard got into place, 60% reduction in the number of explosions and fires associated with grain dust. I think that if abiding by current regulation will certainly help with the basic house cleaning requirements. However, a robust standard that lays out specific requirements for all employers to follow will ensure that everybody follows the same sheet of music. The particulars that are in place today are optional recommendations to folks. Mr. Folk's letter itself calls attention to some of the standards and some of the procedures that are in place at his website, and asks people to make sure that they're aware of those and that they advise their employees and they raise awareness. And we appreciate that, because any raising an awareness with respect to dust explosion knowledge is helpful, but it's not going to prevent dust explosions from happening. If the special emphasis program that has been in place since 2004 was really effective, we wouldn't have seen half of the explosions we've seen in the last few years. So I think it's ineffective, and I think we need to have a current dust explosion comprehensive standard to address those.
Thank you. Mr. McKeon.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Sarvati, you suggest that without appropriate grandfathering provisions, the bill will require changes to every building constructed over the last century. Does OSHA have that authority?
They don't at the present time, Mr. McKeon. I think one of the fallacies of the suggestion that we should just adopt the NFPA standards wholesale by reference is that the present system that we have doesn't permit that to be updated the way the NFPA standards would be updated. All of the NFPA standards have provisions in them that talk about what happens to existing facilities. In the case of the 654, in my written testimony, I've included some information about those look-back provisions and when employers and building owners are required to upgrade their facilities. So even if we are successful in adopting a standard, it's going to take an awful lot of time and education to get people to understand what their obligations are, to understand how those standards apply to their facilities, and so on. And that's why I've emphasized in my testimony, and I repeated verbally here, how important it is for us to start thinking about how to get the information in the hands of people in a meaningful way. Having the data, having the standards out there is not the same thing as having people understand exactly how to apply those standards. And I think the one thing that's missing, I think, from the OSHA emphasis program is working with as many other organizations as they can find to try to make sure that people understand how to apply these standards. OSHA has cooperative programs with a number of different trade associations, many of whom represent industries that have combustible dust hazards in them. We could much more quickly get many more people to understand these hazards if we had a program where we would go out and use those communication channels to make them aware of the NFPA standards, of the application of the housekeeping standard that OSHA has, and other standards, so that they would know how to prevent these events from occurring. Yeah, they're preventable, but it takes a lot more than just putting paper together in Washington to make it effective.
Yeah, I found this is a pretty big country, and when you pass a law here, by the time you get it fully implemented, understood, in force, it's time to write another law. And that is a problem that we deal with on everything we do here. Can you explain for the committee how imposing standards without notice and comment from affected parties can actually delay implementation of safety practices due to the likelihood of litigation?
Yes, Mr. McKeon, I can help answer that question. I think the first point to be made is that the NFPA standards do have ambiguous provisions in them. So simply adopting them wholesale leaves open the question of whether or not a particular standard applies in a particular location. That is, a particular provision applies to a particular location. If you look closely at the standard, what you'll find is two different sections, and I'm talking specifically about 654. The first couple of pages of 654 talk about the programmatic kinds of things that the bill contemplates. Behind that are a series of sections that talk about engineering standards or building design standards and other kinds of things like that that go directly toward the kinds of changes that need to be adopted and used in order to implement the 654 requirement. Some of those are mandatory, and some of those are to be used when the person, in the words of the standard, the authority having jurisdiction, decides that they're appropriate. So one of the things that you end up with ambiguous standards, especially when they are mandatory, is that people disagree on how they apply. And you end up, in that case, when you have a financial penalty like an OSHA fine or citation, you end up with people trying to decide whether or not it's appropriate to comply with that provision and whether or not it applies in their particular circumstance. The standards, the voluntary standards, recognize that distinction. What the hearing process does when OSHA holds its hearings in Washington to review proposed standards is it allows the agency to hear from people who have to live with these provisions on the ground, how these ambiguities are going to affect them, how they're going to be interpreted, what kinds of an impact the different changes are that are proposed are going to have, and equally important, how long it's going to take to implement those changes. So I think if we skip that step, if we don't have the opportunity to hear from people who have to live with these things on the ground in their daily lives, we're going to end up with a standard that's not going to achieve the objectives that we all have, which is to have a safer workplace for everybody.
Thank you very much. Mr. Chairman, my time has expired. I apologize for being late and missing my opening statement. If I could have it included in the record at the appropriate
No objection.
place. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you, everybody, for your testimony. Just going over a number of the testimonies, and I know we've been going back and forth with votes and everything, when you talk about the dust, and you talk about, Mr. Falk, about only 1 32-inch deep of combustible dust covering an area of at least 5% of the total area of a room is enough to cause a catastrophe dust explosion. And when you were explaining that on the second part where, you know, if general cleaning should take care of that particular problem, I know when I dust my house, the most dust is up on my ceiling fan, which is a little difficult to get to at times, but that's where we go for it. Because obviously every time I put the fan on, then the dust is going all over the place, but it still builds up. So I'm trying to think of, when you go for the inspections or even talking to the employers, how do you tell them to clean up there? Because reading the rules, it doesn't sound, you know, keep the hallways clean, keep the floors clean. I didn't see anything that mentioned, is it supposed to be just known that you should clean the ceilings?
Yes, Madam Chairman, or Commissioner, they have a, our housekeeping standard is a performance standard, as is a lot of our standards. So it allows the employers the flexibility to determine what their hazards, what is the hazard they have to address there, and how is the best way to address that hazard. So with respect to rafters and stuff, the accumulation of dust on rafters, under the housekeeping standard is our position that they would be required to make sure that the dust does not accumulate in those areas.
So if the employers know that they're supposed to clean the rafters and the ceilings, how did so much dust, who's inspecting them? Who's making sure that there's not enough combustible dust up there?
Well, as part of our national emphasis program, we are going into facilities that we've identified as having the potential for combustible dust hazards, and that would be part of the inspection process to look into those areas.
Mr. Wright, do you have any answers to that?
Well, I wish I did, other than my firm recommendation that we have a comprehensive dust standard that will address those areas. And I might add that in addition to simple cleanup, one cannot go into a confined space with an air hose and just push dust around, particularly if there are live ignition sources available. Because in an attempt to clean up the area, the person may in fact create the disaster that he's trying to avoid. And we would think that a comprehensive dust standard would help advise people on what the proper and safe way to clean up these facilities is, rather than just relying on a good housekeeping standard, as it were.
Well, one of the things, I know that we have a grain handling standard, and I'm just, again, thinking of common sense things that happen around my house. I feed the birds in the winter. So when I open that bag and I'm pouring it into my plastic container, a whole bunch of dust comes up. And I'm thinking, wow, I'm breathing this. So now I only do it outside. So if you're in a plant and you're working with all of these chemicals, and whether it's grain, whether it's sugar, flour, gosh, I'm not knowledgeable in those areas, but that's an awful lot of stuff that's going up in the air and people's in the lungs and everything else like that. So with some of the incidents that we have seen, and unfortunately with too many people being killed, what is the problem of trying to get almost all the different kind of dusts under one kind of program so that particular manufacturer could actually follow those rules?
I'm assuming that's addressed to me. I'm sorry. I would say that what we do is we already, as part of our inspection process and the rules that we have that are mandatory, all the 17 standards that I noted in my testimony that we believe are applicable to combustible dust are mandatory. Employers are required to follow those. To answer part of your question, too, is about the dust. It's not necessarily just all housekeeping. We also have a standard on ventilation, and which we require employers to make sure that that they're venting out the dust away from outside the facility. Also, part of this, as part of the housekeeping, may mean that the employer would be required to ensure engineering controls were in place so that the dust would not even escape the process itself, and so thus have hoods on top of drums or whatever, so that the dust would be captured and would not get out into the workplace itself. So there's a series of things that actually would be applicable, and we think that we have all these in place.
But obviously that didn't happen because the plant did explode. Ms. Spencer, do you have anything to add to the conversation that we've been hearing?
Yes, I do. First, NFPA would like to commend OSHA for all the work that they've done on the dust hazards as well as the CSB. Mr. Folk mentioned that the housekeeping standard is performance-based, and that is correct, and I do agree with that. However, looking through the OSHA regulations, there are 3 or 4 places with just a few very general, non-specific type requirements, such as the floor of every workroom shall be maintained in a clean and, so far as possible, a dry condition. NFPA codes and standards go so far beyond that, where it really discusses the different types of hazards that can occur in a facility. And as Mr. Wright pointed out, just telling them to do housekeeping isn't enough, because in some cases housekeeping can actually cause the explosion if not done properly. NFPA codes and standards address exactly how to do the cleanup properly, like for instance with a special hazard such as metals. Before you can even begin the cleanup, NFPA 484 requires a preliminary cleanup using non-sparking scoops and soft bristle brushes. So you can go through a plant and you can see footsteps and you know that there's a dust hazard. So that means that there needs to be more housekeeping. Okay, so you clean it up 24 hours a day. There's still dust there. That means there's a bigger problem in the system that needs to be addressed through equipment, dust collection, and other types of requirements to protect the workers.
Thank you. If I may, Mr. Chairman, just to Mr. Volk, has OSHA, with the budgetary pullbacks over the last several years, do you have enough inspectors to really keep up with everything that's going on in all the different plants that we have across this country?
You know, what I would say to that, we have a very effective inspection program. We have a very specific targeting program for our inspections. We have what we call our site-specific targeting, where we identify those employers that have the highest injury and illness rates, and those are the ones that are on for a comprehensive wall-to-wall inspection. We also have different programs where our national emphasis programs, which we have here in combustible dust, and we have a whole series of national emphasis programs where we target those particular hazards that we find the most causing the greatest injury or illnesses to employers.
But that's not actually answering my question. I'm asking, do you feel that you have enough inspectors to do the work that needs to be done around the country?
Well, I would say that we are obviously doing the job we need to be doing, because if you look today, the most recent data that we had the lowest injury, illness, and fatality rates ever. So I think the system that we have in place, we are doing the job, and we are getting to the places we need to get to.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back my time.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I'd like to thank the witnesses. Thank you for your testimony. This is a very important hearing dealing with the health and safety and even lives of American workers. Thank you for being here. I'd like to start with Mr. Servata, please. I understand you're an industrial hygienist with experiences in different types of dust. Can you estimate how many different types of dust exist in the workplace today?
No, because they're probably innumerable. The one thing I wanted to make a point about this, the notion of combustible dust, when we talk about this, we have a definition that NFPA has come up with that's very broad. Any dust except for what we call mineral dust, things like rock and sand and that sort of thing, can be combustible under the right circumstances. So it's a very broad subject area. Mr. Folk mentioned that they sent out 30,000 letters. I've heard numbers like 80,000 workplaces around the country. If you ask me, I'd say the number of workplaces that might have in some part of their operation a combustible dust potential is on the order of maybe several million. It's a very, very common problem if you're using certain kinds of things and doing certain kinds of things. And I want to clarify one thing, if I may, Mr. Davis, about the comment that Mr. Wright made about the West Pharmaceutical. The problem at West was that we had a chemical substance in a form that you would not expect to present a combustible dust hazard. It was a liquid slurry of polyethylene. And if we are to believe what the report says about that, the polyethylene that was in this slurry was used in a very thin quantity on the parts in the facility. Those parts were dried, and somehow that small quantity was carried off of the parts up into the ceiling and deposited in concentrations that were not visible to the naked eye. In other words, as Mrs. McCarthy suggested earlier, when we open a bag, we can see the dust. Here you're opening a container that has a liquid in it. And when I said I was humbled by the experience in reading the report, what I meant was I would never have thought that using that slurry in that circumstance would have produced enough dust, even over the 10-year period between 1996 and when the explosion occurred, probably not exactly 10 years, but anyway, over that period of time, that there would have been an accumulation sufficient to cause the devastation that occurred there. Obviously, something happened. I don't know exactly what it was, but what I'm telling you is even with my 35 years of experience, having looked at these problems over the years, looking at that particular process, I would not have said combustible dust might be a problem. That's what I mean when I say it's hard to know where combustible dust is an issue. Yes, there is information. Many material safety data sheets talk about combustible dust being a potential hazard. That's the starting place. The process that has to occur subsequent to that involves everybody in the facility. And in regard to the question Mrs. McCarthy asked about housekeeping, when I was working with companies that have, and still work with companies that have combustible dust issues, you have to have a housekeeping program that involves using vacuum cleaners, long-handled brooms, all kinds of things, even to the extent of, on a periodic basis, either semi-annually or annually, going through and cleaning those flat surfaces. When I was a young industrial hygienist, one of the old gray-haired graybeards in the business advised me, when you first go into a plant, look and see what the housekeeping is like. The housekeeping will tell you how much pride the people in that facility have in their operation. And if they keep a clean plant, the chances are they're going to be paying attention to the small things. So I think the problem that we have here is not a question of standards. We have lots of standards. The standards, even the voluntary standards like the NFPA standards, can be enforced by OSHA under the General Duty Clause, and that by no means is a voluntary requirement. And so it's not a question of having standards and knowing what to do. It's a question of getting the information in the hands of the right people.
I'd like to follow up, and I think I understand you say there's different types of dust. Then do those different types of dust have different combustible properties?
Absolutely. In fact, in the NFPA standard, we've heard the reference to the 1/32 of an inch of dust. The NFPA standard sets that as the minimum level for highly explosive dust. There's actually a formula in the standard that talks about making adjustments to that level depending on what's called the bulk density of the dust. And you could spend hours talking about these kinds of technical details. The point is, not every combustible dust is the same. Not every combustible dust presents the same degree of hazard, and that's why, in the context of the NFPA standards, the authority having jurisdiction and the people who implement these standards have to make judgments, and we're introducing the human element again here. They're making judgments, fallible human judgments, about how to apply those standards. That's a different process than what we've been talking about in the enforcement context.
Thank you. My time has expired. Now yield back.
Mr. Sarbanes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'm listening to this discussion of the housekeeping standards, whether they're sufficient or not sufficient. And I mean, your description of what happened with that liquid container seems to me to be an argument that housekeeping standards, given what you said, Mrs. Spencer, aren't always going to get to the problem, because you need more specific kinds of oversight to determine whether the workplace is being maintained in a way that is safe and is going to prevent these accidents. I wanted to ask you, Mr. Folk, right now there's a comprehensible or comprehensive, hopefully it's comprehensible too, but grain dust standard in place, right, that OSHA administers. It's been in place.
We do have a grain dust standard, that's
okay.
correct.
So if there weren't one in place, would you be arguing that the housekeeping standards and other things that your agency engages in are sufficient that you wouldn't need to have a grain dust standard in place today? Just assume that it hadn't been done in 1987, and we were having a discussion today about the grain dust standard. Would you be taking the same position on that you're taking with respect to the combustible dust standard?
Well, Mr. Sarbanes, we have, if you look at the grain dust standard, it actually does have focuses on housekeeping, ventilation, the standards that we have there in place. And so I said if there was not, and prior to the implementation of the grain dust standard, employers in those industries were being cited under those our mandatory standards for housekeeping and ventilation and so forth. And yes, there is a grain dust standard, but unfortunately, there are still explosions in grain dust facilities, and there are still fatalities in grain dust facilities. So, you know.
So what's that mean?
Well, I mean,
there's a lot less of them than there used to be, right, before the standard was put in place.
The number of explosions. I think there's the number of fatalities have reduced, but if you look at, like I said, I mentioned earlier, we actually have had the number of fatalities have across the board we have been able to reduce those across the board in the country. We're at our lowest rate in fatalities, and also the lowest rate of injuries and illnesses in the country as ever experienced right now.
See, I come, and I assume that light is not correct because
That's right. It's not correct.
Okay.
I'm keeping the council busy.
I mean, I come not knowing a lot about the subject ahead of time, so I've been listening very carefully, and it seems like you're hemmed in by a bunch of things. One is that you have this precedent of the grain dust standard, which seems to have made a significant difference by raising awareness significantly on it. You got the Chemical Safety Board, you got the NFPA that are urging that there be a specific standard with respect to combustible dust. And you yourself keep saying that, well, you know, we're doing all the things that what I'm hearing you say is we're kind of doing all the things that we would need to do if there was in fact a comprehensive combustible dust standard in place. We're doing those things now, so I don't understand where the resistance is to establishing this standard that's being urged left, right, and center, it seems to me, by everybody around you. So if you could just explain that a little bit.
Well, Mr. Sarbanes, I would say, as I mentioned earlier in my testimony, we have instituted this national emphasis program, and we're gathering information from that to determine whether or not all are the standards that we have in place now sufficient to meet the hazards that we're dealing with. And we've not ruled out the possibility of doing rulemaking. So we are looking, that is an option for us still, but we're just trying to collect the data through the national emphasis program, where we're looking at as many sites as we can and inspecting those sites to determine, do we have do our standards actually cover what we need to cover, or is there some holes in the coverage that we need to address, and that would a comprehensive standard address that? And I would note too about the grain dust standard. The grain dust standard covers a lot of other things, and part of what one of the focus points of the grain dust standard was engulfment, where we were having significant problems where people were in grain silos and were being engulfed and resulting in fatalities as that part. So there's a series of things that we actually look at in the grain dust.
I think it's great that the grain dust standard is there. I just think it creates a pretty powerful precedent to address this kind of situation in a similar way. And I allow that not everything that happens in the past is a precedent that should be applied broadly, but it seems to me that there's sufficient evidence and statements by those who know this area best that a comprehensive standard here would make a lot of sense. And one of the things I worry about is the negative implication of it not being there. In other words, if there's a standard that exists with respect to other things, and yet there's continued resistance. Now, you say your mind is open, and I appreciate that, but if there's a perception of continued resistance to establishing similar kinds of standards in this area, then people are going to draw from that. They're going to infer maybe that the attention, the awareness, whatever it is not as heightened as it ought to be. And so there is a value in setting these standards, actually, that goes beyond that's more than the sum of the parts. I mean, you're kind of talking about, you got all the parts in place to do the kind of oversight that needs to happen to protect people. But what you get by establishing a comprehensive standard is you ratchet it up. You ratchet the awareness of it up. You heighten awareness so that, as Ms. Spencer was saying, it's not sufficient in people's minds people don't get complacent just because they've pushed a broom or they've vacuumed every 12 hours, because they understand there's sort of a higher level of scrutiny expectation that's in place. So, Mr. Wright, maybe you could speak to that idea of heightened awareness being part of what we're trying to achieve here with a comprehensive standard.
Oh, yes, sir. I think if you do a comparison with the grain dust standard, as I testified to, it has specific schedules. Written programs are required. You don't use compressed air necessarily to clean up dust. You remove anything that's greater than an eighth of an inch thick immediately, and you ID priority areas that you're going to work in. This is all absent from the general housekeeping standard with respect to combustible dust, and that was one reason that we recommended that a comprehensive standard be in place. And as you pointed out, a comprehensive dust standard will keep this awareness alive forever, as opposed to a finite point in time that an emphasis program may, in fact, people become complacent with and forget about because they're lucky and they haven't had any fatalities or incidents. It's not unlike what I worked with for most of my adult life, explosives. People do die with explosives because they do get complacent with what they're handling. The same can be true with dust.
Thank you. My time's finished. I just note that with an emphasis program also, something else may come along that requires new emphasis, pulls the attention away from this other thing, and if you have it in place as something you have to continually look at, that also drives the resource question that Congresswoman McCarthy asked, because then you might decide you don't have enough resources to do the job you need to do to cover the permanent standard or comprehensive standards in place and to do the other emphasis things that you need to do. Thank you, Mr.
Thank you, Mr. Payne.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Mr. Chairman, for calling this very important hearing. You know, it seemed that to me, primarily to the OSHA Assistant Secretary, that we would see that the prevention of deaths and injuries would be decreased as we move forward, because we have new techniques and we have a knowledge of how to try to prevent things. But it seems that we still are having unnecessary deaths. You know, we had the hearing about Centis laundry and the deaths that was occurring in that industry, and lo and behold, shortly after that hearing, we had 2 deaths right in my district at the Northeast Linen Company in Linden, New Jersey, where 2 employees, improperly trained, improperly prepared to do that, suffocated to death. This is like a week or 2 after we had the hearing talking about why can't we have better standards. Ms. Woolsey and Mr. Wilson and other members came to the hearing in my district. And so I do have a concern that we are really not stepping up to the plate, even while we, as a matter of fact, while we were having a hearing in Linden that day, 2 men from my district fell from cleaning windows over in New York. One actually lived, to be honest. But Ms. Folk, at our last hearing when you testified, when you were here last testifying at a hearing on OSHA's failure to issue standards, I expressed my concern at that hearing with OSHA's promotion of voluntary programs. We hear a lot about voluntary programs. Companies want to do the right thing, and therefore we should leave it up to them. Government that governs least is best, you know, keep the government out of the workforce. That's the philosophy, it seems. But I asked you about the alliances and the alliances over mandatory standards. Now, it seemed with your new combustible dust website and your refusal to work on a dust standard that you're following the same path as we heard about the voluntary standards that you talked about before in that industry. At that hearing, I asked you specifically then about the Reactives Alliance and whether you thought that voluntary efforts like alliances, and specifically the Reactives Alliances, were more effective than OSHA standards. At that hearing several months ago, you replied yes, because, quote, OSHA is able to outreach to so many more employers, and thus cover so many more employees by quickly developing and working together to develop these guidance documents, these best practices, these training modules. Now, at this time, we have 4 people dead from a preventable reactives explosion in Jacksonville. And according to OSHA's own records, the only thing the Reactives Alliance did was to put up a website and set up some booths at a conference and actually train only 36 people. And the alliance was discontinued last year. Now, it seems to me that if you had changed the process safety management standard as the Chemical Safety Board recommended, thousands of workers would have been trained by now. These standards would have been mandatory, and it's possible that these 4 workers in Jacksonville who are now dead may have been alive. And I fear that the way you're heading with combustible dust is the same as we have had in the past. So my question, so how can you still tell me that Reactives Alliance was more effective than revising the process safety management standards would have been? And can you tell me why a standard that everyone must comply with won't be more effective and prevent reactive chemicals or dust explosions? You know, we still seem to have this this non-mandatory, let everyone do the right thing, and it's not working. I just like to get a clarification because I asked this question specifically and got that answer that I quoted from the testimony.
Well, Mr. Payne, first of all, I would really, I do believe strongly in our Alliance program because I do believe that it allows us to outreach to so many more employers. But with respect to reactives, I would first mention the fact that we do have a number of OSHA standards, including process safety management, hazard communication, flammability and combustible liquids, fire protection, they're already on the books that are applicable to reactive chemicals. So we do have standards that are in place on that. So we are that. With respect to where we are, once again, we are looking at. We've not ruled out doing a standardist, and we're actually working with the Process Safety Alliance, which is an alliance that we put together with the Center for Chemical Process Safety, the American Chemical Society, American Chemistry Society, Petroleum Institute, the Petrochemical, the Chlorine Institute, EPA. We brought all this expertise together to focus on reactive. So we are looking at how we can go about that. And we are trying to be effective on this particular issue.
But you're still opposed to mandatory. I mean, you said that you still think that it's going to work out all right. How many deaths does it take to see that it's not working?
Well, I would say we're still looking at the issue of a possible standard. We've not ruled it out. I wouldn't say I would be we're looking at the possibility of working with this, and the fact that we put this Process Safety Alliance together will help us determine, first of all, how these coverage with respect to reactives, because that's a question in and of itself as to how should be the scope of a reactive and the definition of reactives.
Well, my time has expired, but what bothers me with this administration is whether it's the beef that they said was unfit for human consumption, but then OSHA concluded that it was not injurious to your health. Some I can't figure out, but that was last week's hearing. I can't figure out how they said we had a great recall of hundreds of millions of tons of beef and found out that 80% had been consumed. Well, why do you talk about a recall? How can you recall something that's already consumed? It's not recalled, it's eaten. But once again, the lack of enforcement, I had to ask the witness, did you see the same video I saw about these cows that couldn't walk to slaughter, so they put them on lift trucks and rolled them in and dropped them in because you're supposed to be able to walk to your slaughterhouse? And there just seemed to be the fiddling while Rome is burning. We have to start protecting. American people deserve better. They deserve better for their food, they deserve better for their health, and they deserve better for working conditions for working men and women. I think my time has expired. Thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Folk, I guess what haunts me as I listen to this, to many of your answers, is the words of Ms. Miser when she said that when she saw the work of the Chemical Safety Board, the work product there and the recommendations, she thought at last something would finally happen that would protect other workers in these dust-related industries from the horror that her brother and her family went through. But I must tell you, I just see such an incredible lack of urgency on your part about the role of your agency to protect workers that it's astounding. You mentioned that you're now engaged in process accident mitigation with the chemical industry and the refiners, and you rattled off a whole list of people there. That's after one of the worst accidents and one of the most scalding reports by the Chemical Safety Board that we've seen in the history of this program. And the negligence and the conspiracy to avoid spending money on that refinery reached all the way in to the boardroom of British Petroleum and caused the exit of a number of those officials and a huge fine. We're hell on wheels after the accident, but nobody was inspecting that facility to see the buildup of the process problems that led to that accident prior to that accident. You keep talking about how you're citing people on housekeeping, and most of it's after an accident. You come in after the fact and you say you violated housekeeping. And yet, as we've seen in the exchange here between the members and you, it's quite unclear exactly what housekeeping means and whether housekeeping itself would result in a diminution of the accidents. We had the housekeeping standards, and we keep the accidents going. You know, I guess one of the nice things about seniority around here is you're around long enough to see these arguments come around. I was here when grain elevators were popping up like fireworks, and we went through all of these same arguments, and we went through hidden places of dust because some of these grain elevators had false ceilings in them, depending upon their capacity and their design, and the housekeeping made them more dangerous. I went through this in terms of occupational health on dust standards in the cotton dust standards, and their housekeeping again. Well, we pick it up after every shift. We blow it around, and we found out that took engineering. In fact, many in that industry now say that engineering changed the productivity of those plants that engaged in it and kept them competitive for many more years against foreign competition than if they hadn't done it, because they had to invest in a new generation of machines that made them far more effective. And yet, against that evidence, against a 60% reduction in the explosions on grain, you want to suggest that you'd like to keep the housekeeping standards that we had before the grain explosions, that this industry hasn't quite come to it yet. And yet we see a process here. I mean, we're trying to be user-friendly here. We see a process. Mr. Savardi makes the best case for the Fire Association standards. He says they've taken into account, in answering Mr. Davis's question, they recognize there's different kinds of data. They recognize there's different kind of specific gravities or whatever densities that he pointed out. This is what they do. They arrive at these consensus standards across a broad range of hazards within particular industries, and in some cases, they're adopted on a mandatory basis, some cases apparently on a voluntary basis, some places they're incorporated into existing codes, and it's an evolutionary ongoing process. You're here clinging to what you've done, and it's turned out to be incredibly ineffective in terms of getting the kinds of results that workers in this country are entitled to, the kind of results that we saw in cotton dust standards, that we saw in grain standards. But I went to those hearings at those elevators when I was a new member of Congress. I listened to those workers and to their families, and I listened to those owners. But in fact, the grain standard has turned out to be the right thing to do. There comes a time, you know, you're suggesting that if a person can navigate the website, if they get the advantage of the emphasis program, if they get the letter and they understand it, if they know that somehow that the grain standards may also apply to their business, even though they're not in the grain business, that they can knit together a system of safety. I think Ms. Miser's brother's entitled to more than that. And I think the workers in Savannah were entitled to more than that. And I appreciate that this was a liquid that we didn't understand, except we understood the purpose of its application was to create dust between the layers and the products and rubber. But housekeeping wouldn't take care of that because the dust migrated. It was a spotless facility. It just didn't anticipate that. So, you know, we can continue to do this very convoluted, disjointed system and tell the workers to take the hindmost. That's just not going to be acceptable to this committee, and it's not going to be acceptable to the Congress. You know, we're trying to do this at a threshold that works for employers, that works for regulators, and that allows a process to go forward to have the continuous improvement. But you want to cling to the past, you're welcome to it. But it's turned out to be fatal for the American workers. I just don't understand it. I just don't understand it. You're certainly free to reply because you obviously don't agree with me.
Well, Mr. Chairman Miller, I would say once again, as I mentioned earlier, we have been inspecting for combustible dust hazards. We've been doing this since the 70s, so it's not that we're not a Johnny-come-lately on this issue. We've been working on this issue. We've been issuing citations to employers, and once again, the number of inspections that we're doing, we have been continually increasing the number of inspections that over the past number of years. So we are getting out to those facilities. We are targeting the ones that our emphasis programs are targeting.
Again, let me explain something. When you answered Ms. McCarthy, you talked about injuries and falls and those kinds of things. That was exactly what your attention was directed to with respect to British Petroleum. That everybody was walking around saying how many worker safety days did they have, and nobody fell and broke their leg, sprained their ankle, or lost a day of work. And meanwhile, this refinery was getting ready for one of the great explosions in our industrial history.
Well, I would, with respect to...
That's how you said you selected your intensity of your inspections. You go to those industries where you have the most slips and falls.
That is part of our site-specific targeting. That is correct, Mr. Chairman. But we also have our local emphasis programs and our national emphasis programs, which target those areas where we find, particularly our local emphasis programs, focus on those local issues where they're seeing that they're having the most serious safety and health issues. And so they target them on a local level. And then on a national level, we're looking at where we have a lot of where we're seeing on a national basis safety and health issues to address those. And I think, once again, the statistics, the injury and illness data shows that we have the lowest rates we've ever had. We've had the lowest number of fatalities we've ever had. So I believe we're at least moving in the right direction. And as I indicated here on this particular issue, we are looking to gather the data from our national emphasis program to determine whether or not we need to go to rulemaking.
But Imperial Sugar was not on your inspection list.
It would have been on our specialist on a national emphasis program, yes. Yeah.
But it was not. You're telling me about a program that has evolved since the 1970s, and Imperial Sugar wasn't on the list.
On the national emphasis program?
No. On your inspection list
on our site-specific targeting. Mr. Chairman, that's correct.
That's correct.
They had their lost time injury and illness rates were very low, and so they were not under our site-specific targeting.
My time is, I'll come back around, but Mr. McKeon.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Ms. Spencer, H.R. 5522 suggests that OSHA create a standard no less productive than the NFPA 654 and 484. How many other standards are referenced in those two documents? Are these in the public domain? And if not, how much would it cost a non-member of your organization to obtain these materials to ensure any dust program meets the NFPA standards?
Mr. McKeon, there are a number of documents referenced in all of our NFPA codes and standards because, for instance, when there are electrical concerns, as there are with dust, it would refer to the National Electrical Code. So there are a number of references. All of the the specific commodity dusts are referenced back to NFPA 654, which is the fundamentals of dust document. You also asked, are they available to the public? All of our codes and standards are posted on our website for free read only, so they're available for anybody with no cost. If I may add another point, Mr. Sarvati mentioned his opinion that the NFPA codes and standards are ambiguous, and I respectfully disagree with that. And he specifically mentioned that the authority having jurisdiction and other enforcers have a lot of leeway. In NFPA codes and standards, in the body of the standard, which is the mandatory portion of the standard, it's written in mandatory language, all with shalls. There are shoulds in the advisory material that gives people information. With any kind of a regulation, including OSHA regulations, there's some judgment that is necessary. Every situation cannot be addressed due to the variables at each facility. The committees and the documents cannot address every single permutation of how a facility is laid out. So there has to be judgment through the authority having jurisdiction and the users of the standard. So I definitely disagree that the codes and standards are ambiguous, and his assertion that there is not buy-in. NFPA is an ANSI accredited association, and all of our committees are balanced, and we have public comment too. ANSI requires one set of public comment on the changes. We have two. We have a whole system set up such that consensus is well established. Also, Assistant Secretary Folk mentioned that more data are needed before the codes and standards before it's clear that a rulemaking should be done. And I disagree with that also respectfully. The investigations just through the CSB have pointed to all the same things, and they're the same things that NFPA codes and standards have requirements on. It's a broad nature of problems with the different types of dust, and NFPA has had written documents since 1923, and decades before that there was initial work on that. So it's highly unlikely that there would be anything profoundly new in the area of dust explosions that would be uncovered with the National Emphasis Program. The requirements are out there in NFPA codes and standards, and we would like OSHA to mandatorily reference them as opposed to taking bits and pieces and creating their own regulation on dust hazards. NFPA has 7 dust-related documents, and that we request that these be referenced mandatorily such that it's a comprehensive coverage of dust hazards. Thank you.
I'm looking at this standard for the NFPA 654 standard for the prevention of fire and dust explosions from the manufacturing, processing, and handling of combustible particulate solids. There's quite a bit of detailed explanation, and I'm wondering what kind of a degree you would need to, to put this into place. I come from a business background, and I visit companies, some small, some large, and small companies, I don't know where they would get the people to read and put in force all of these things, but I understand the seriousness of the problem, but I like what you said about it takes judgment, and at some point there has to be some local judgment, and I would think that people are trying to do their best. We can put lots of laws in, we could have somebody enforcing it every one, and I guess there are still some accidents. I know the object is to prevent all accidents, and I wish we could, and I guess we should continue to work toward that. But the more we write more documents like this that have more and more detailed 8.9.7, the ignition temperature of a layer of dust on hot surface, it just goes on and on and on. And I appreciate what you're doing, and it just looks like a very tough situation. And I've sat through now a number of these hearings where we have had very serious accidents, where we've had people lose their lives and have loved ones here that are feeling that loss, and they're all tragedies, and I don't think anybody does any of these things on purpose. And it would be good if we could eliminate all of the potential problems. I commend what you are doing to try to alleviate things and encourage you to continue it. But I guarantee you that a few of us here passing a law is not going to change all of that. As much as we try, I don't know anybody more passionate, more caring about it than Chairman Miller, but it's a tough situation. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
If I may speak, Mr. McCann, to your points. Go ahead. You noted what kind of degree do you need to be able to look at this, and what you actually cited was in our advisory material. What we try to do is also educate the people who are using the standard, so we have non-mandatory sort of educational tidbits in the back. The actual standard, it looks pretty big, but the actual standard is about 20 pages, and it may look complicated. When you're actually in the industry, you're going to know about a lot of these things already. This is just great reminders, mandatory reminders of what you have to do to keep your facility safe. Thank you.
Thank you. And I would just add to that at the outset, I forget if you were here or not, but it was made pretty clear that this is a process. It's a consensus process. These drafts or regulations are a result of a consensus process with business and regulators and other associations and other interested people. That's why we tried to go there first on that was sort of the lowest temperature. Mr. Folk, my understanding is that Imperial Sugar wasn't on the National Emphasis Program list either.
No, that's incorrect, Your Honor, Mr. Chairman.
Okay, could you check that, because that's our information? If you would check that out, we were told locally.
They had not been inspected under the National Emphasis Program, but they would have been on the list of facilities to be inspected eventually.
Okay, well, if you could provide that information, because we've received information.
I'll be happy to check into that. Yes.
When we were on site, that was not the case. So, Ms. Miser, what do you think?
As far as the standard goes, I feel like, to me, it makes no sense to do all this work and have everything put into this and not just make a standard. If you're going to do it all anyways, and everybody says they're going to do it, then make the standard. And I also feel like there are some companies, I mean, there are many companies that are doing it, and that are trying to do it, and that are doing their best. But the standard are for the companies that really don't care, and there are companies out there that don't care. I don't like to say that, but it's a fact. It's just the way things go, and I feel like the standard, if there's a standard made, it will be applied to those people to where it needs to be. And I would really love to see it done. And I mean, there's nothing else I can say about that except for that it really, it would target the people that it should be, the standard would be, and the voluntary things. I think people are trying to do that too, but I think people would take it more seriously if there was a standard also, rather than just voluntarily doing this, because I feel like if you're volunteering to do it, sure, you're doing a good thing, you're doing what you should be doing, but you're not going to pay as close attention as to what's really going on.
Thank you. Mr. Wright, if I might, we're going to end this hearing because we got to vote, and I don't think we can justify your time to wait for us to go to another vote. I'm correct in understanding, Mr. Wright, that you essentially said that OSHA's response to your recommendations was unacceptable, and that is or is not the first time that the Chemical Safety Board has made that reaction to a response to their recommendations. And
is this with respect to the reactive chemicals?
Yes.
Yes, sir. We have an open, unacceptable standing, I guess, or classification for that particular recommendation to OSHA. If I may, sir, I would like to add with respect to the discrete regulations that Secretary Folk spoke of, the general duty clause, the housekeeping standard, the ventilation, the electrical, those are all discrete documents that one would have to go search for or hunt out or review. And what we're asking for is something that would give us one-stop shopping that would encapsulate all the requirements as well as those that are contained in FPAs. There's no place within the OSHA standards currently for management of change, engineering design, explosion prevention techniques and specifications. And we would like to see those included in this comprehensive standard.
Well, I think that goes to Ms. Miser's point, and that is that businesses will, they essentially either cherry pick the knowledge, or they, even without cherry picking it, they're not aware that this is contained somewhere else, or they do the things that cherry pick the easy things to do, or they think they're responding properly. But unless they can see a continuum of a plan and a scheme how to keep the workplace safe, they in fact, I don't think are able to properly comply in terms of providing the kinds of protections that are necessary. I just, I would just say in conclusion that I would hope that OSHA, I would hope that our legislation passes, because we're not going to hopefully not leave this to doubt, given the kind of accident that we've seen recently in Savannah, and we've seen up until Savannah, that we have an opportunity to deal with that. But at some point, this has to be a comprehensive regime. I believe it has to have the force and effect of regulations for the core component of that regime, and I would hope that rather than avoiding that process, that OSHA would understand that. I appreciate you want to run every trap until you get to be told to do that. I think you have to show that you can do both, because I think at the end of the day, this is not going to work without that regulatory scheme. As I said, we're trying to start out here at a user-friendly point, and then OSHA can make its determinations over the next couple of years. But clearly, this regime should be put in place. I'm a partisan with respect to the Chemical Safety Board. I worked very hard for them to come into existence, and I fought very hard against the chemical industry and others that wanted them out of existence. We knew what we were doing. We were trying to get somebody who was impartial, who wasn't there to find fault, who was there to look at the causation of these and make recommendations. And I think that they have developed over the years to be the gold standard in that effort back and forth. But I do not take their finding of this response being unacceptable, and I do not take lightly to the idea that that we can somehow tailor a lot of different programs at a lot of different levels and recommendations and websites and all the rest of that, and then we can then impute the kind of knowledge and activity that is necessary to protect these workers. So this committee will continue that deliberation, but I hope that we will shortly be able to take action. And I want to thank all of you for your testimony, for your expertise, and I hope that we'll be able to continue to call on you as we move to the next stage of this process. Thank you.
Is everybody tired? Thank you for the water, by the way.